20. The mystery mind manipulators. There are many cases on record where, as a result of a near contact or a close contact with a UFO, an individual has been healed of some disability, or has even been rejuvenated, both physically and mentally. However, often on these occasions, the individual's mind has been taken over by the UFO nauts for their own purposes. An outstanding example is the case of Hans Lauritzen in Denmark. On the evening of December 7, 1967, he was with 4 friends by a wood called Herskoven, not far from Copenhagen. Hans Lauritzen suffered from hepatitis, a severe liver complaint. He had to give up his work, and was extremely tired all the time. On this particular evening, it was very difficult for him to keep up with his friends, and he had to stop for a rest several times. After a while, the friends decided to spread out. It was then that Lauritzen saw 2 big, dim, yellow globes, about 100 meters away. Another member of the party spotted one of the globes. Lauritzen asked his friends if he could take a walk in the wood alone for about 10 minutes. This was agreed. He walked into the woods, in what seemed to him later, as a semi-trance. It was as if he was being guided. Eventually, he felt a presence of something above, but was unable to see anything. Then, he said what was the most important thing to him at that moment. "Please help humanity. Please let me help you in helping humanity." A telepathic conversation in Danish ensued between the UFO entities and himself. He then continued to walk in a semi-trance. Suddenly, he heard his friends calling him. He looked at his watch. More than an hour had passed. He apologized for having been away so long. Later, it was discovered that all 5 members of the party had been impelled to walk alone in the woods. One of them was blinded by a bluish light. Everyone suffered from after effects. They all started to walk back down the hill to where Lauritzen's car was parked. Suddenly, he started to run down the slope, and the others could not keep up with him. It was then that he realized that his chronic hepatitis had been cured. This was confirmed later by his doctors after a medical examination. His liver, which had been 10 centimeters too big, was now back to normal size. Shortly after this contact had taken place, Lauritzen felt that something was spreading inside his body. Something was moving up along the spine, from the bottom to the neck, and to the back of the head. He added that it seemed to be spreading in the whole nervous system. Then he found that no longer was his free will able to function. Often, strange thoughts of a negative and destructive character came to him. He realized that something had been done to his brain. He could no longer discern right from wrong. Every time he thought of telling the truth about what had been done to him, unbearable pains came in the spine, the neck and the head. Lauritzen maintains that is why the contactees always tell something good about the UFOs. They are forced to do so. He states that thousands of people on this planet have been treated in this way, and are under the control of the UFO nauts. Eventually, Lauritzen discovered how to outwit the pain control. He found that it only worked when thinking emotionally about the UFOs. If he sat down thinking of something else and wrote about the UFOs without any emotion, then the pain control did not work. As a result, Hans Lauritzen was able to give his fantastic story to the world. A much more recent case concerns the experiences of Señor Ventura Mccarras, a 73-year-old gaucho of Tres Arroyos, province of Buenos Aires, Argentina. These were fully described in 2 excellent articles by Pedro Romaniuk in successive issues of Flying Saucer Review. An abridged version is given here, but anyone who wishes to read the full account of this fascinating case should get in touch with the review. At about 20 past 10 in the evening of December 30, 1972, Señor Ventura Mccarras was sitting by a small fire, some 6 meters from the wooden shack where he lives. At his side were his dog, and his cat, with her 3 kittens. He had just finished supper, and was listening to his transistor radio. Suddenly, the radio began to fade out. Finally, after banging it to no effect, Señor Mccarras switched the machine off. It was then that he heard a very loud humming noise, and upon looking up, was astounded to see a powerful light flooding the whole neighborhood. Inside this light, he could observe a large object. It was estimated later that it was about 20 to 25 meters in diameter. In the upper portion of the object, Señor Mccarras could see a spherical cabin, with 2 small windows. He noticed a figure at one of these windows, attired in clothing made of rolls, which looked inflatable, something like the garments astronauts wear. On the UFO naut's head was a helmet, from the top of which, a tube passed down into a box on his back. The craft tilted slightly, and Senor Mccarras was able to obtain a full view of the lighted cabin. He now saw that there was a second occupant wearing the same type of clothing. Both UFO nauts had slanted eyes. 2 more windows could be seen on the other side of the cabin. There also appeared to be an emblem between the 2 far windows. This consisted of a seahorse wearing a crown, with some symbols to the right of it. Suddenly, a powerful flash of light came from underneath the object, blinding Senor Mccarras for a moment, and causing him to look downwards. The humming noise became louder, and shortly afterwards the craft moved off towards the northeast, leaving behind a smell of sulfur in the air for some seconds. Earlier in this book, the effect of UFOs on animals was discussed. In this particular case, the dog and the mystery mind manipulators, the kittens did not appear to have suffered any ill effects. However, immediately the sudden flash of light ended, the mother cat was nowhere to be found. It was not until February 16, 1973, 48 days later, that she reappeared, and her back still showed scorch marks and burns. Senor Mccarras suffered considerable unpleasant effects for some days after the event. These included a tingling in the legs, severe headaches, violent diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, loss of hair, small red pruriginous pustules on the back of his neck, difficulty in speaking, and watering of the eyes. Eventually his health began to improve, and he began to grow a 3rd set of teeth. Then amazingly, this poor, almost illiterate peasant began to make the most lucid remarks upon a variety of subjects, with which he had not previously been familiar. It would seem that as a result of his experience, he had been given a remarkable expansion of consciousness. Pedro Romaniuk wrote, "As I mentioned in the first part of this report, about 45 days after his visual subcontact with the UFO and its occupants, Senor Ventura Mccarras, the 73-year-old gaucho of Tres Arroyos, started to behave in a fashion that was not at all the usual one for him. Ever since the incident occurred on December 30, 1972, he has been under constant medical supervision, both clinical and psychiatric. Let us recall, to begin with, that he is a man who is practically totally unable to read or write. But now, suddenly, in his conversations with our investigators, he has begun talking about philosophical, theological, and astronomical concepts, and similar theories. He mentions big figures in miles, and in a matter of seconds he converts them into kilometers. He refers to various planets of the Milky Way, and makes repeated use of the terms, Brother 5, and Brotherhood 5, in connection with those who approach him. He has developed a profound religious feeling, and he is expecting enormous geological cataclysms which will befall our planet as a result of the constant atomic explosions, and which will partly destroy the planet. He has also developed an artistic feeling, inasmuch as he now spends his free time in sculpting from a massive piece of rock, a representation of a craft like the one that he saw on the occasion in question. I have made inquiries among the people who have known Ventura Mccarras for many years, and all of them testify that, prior to his contact with the UFO, he did not possess the knowledge that he now possesses, and that his manner of talking used to be such as is found in anybody whose schooling has been only of the most rudimentary kind. It seems that Senor Mccarras had a second visit from the UFO nauts one night in February, 1973. This time they appeared to him in a most friendly way, and gave him the means to cure cancer. There are certain differences between the respective contacts of Hans Lauritzen and Ventura Mccarras. It would seem that in the case of Hans Lauritzen, though the entities cured his hepatitis, they took over control of his mind, and placed negative thoughts in it. On the other hand, the UFO nauts that possibly subjected Senor Mccarras to a mental projection, thereby expanding his consciousness, seem to have acted from much higher motives. Perhaps there is a cosmic war in progress. The prize being control of the minds of humanity. A battle royal between the forces of good and evil. Some of the most authentic and extraordinary photographs of a UFO were taken on June 1, 1967, at San José de Valderas, near Madrid, Spain. Senor Antonio Ribera, Spain's foremost ufologist, wrote in Flying Saucer Review. San José de Valderas is one of those ultramodern housing settlements, consisting of large blocks of flats, that have sprung up around Madrid in step with this capital's excessive expansion. It so happens by a lucky chance that at San Jose de Valderas, and near the Extremadura highway, there are a few rural belts with meadows and copses of woodland. It was in one of these areas, dominated by the silhouette of the ancient castle of the Marques de Valderas, used at the present time to house a college run by nuns of the Order del Amor de Dios, that several people were enjoying the fresh evening air at sundown on June 1st, or were resting, or reading their papers, when they suddenly saw a strange disc-shaped object, which appeared almost immediately over the castle, and then performed evolutions over the area for a period of some 12 minutes, flying so low that it almost grazed the tops of the trees, fluttering to and fro in a strange movement, like a falling dead leaf, and finally vanishing in the direction of the Extremadura highway. The object appeared to correspond to the classic descriptions of flying saucers. It was perfectly round, about 12 or 13 meters wide, and seemed to consist of two wash basins, placed with their concave sides facing each other. On the under part, the belly of the craft bore a curious sign, very similar to the sign on the UFO seen at Aluche. This was on February 6, 1966, in the Madrid suburb of Aluche. But with the parallel lines, the center one being shorter, linked by another horizontal line. The UFO was not only seen by scores of witnesses, but photographed by at least two of them. After the UFO flew off along the Extremadura highway, where it was seen by numerous other witnesses, including an engineer, the object landed for a few moments on an open piece of ground in the suburb of Santa Monica, some 4 kilometers, as the crow flies from San Jose de Valderas. It landed close to the restaurant known by the name of La Ponderosa. The owner of this restaurant is Señor Antonio Muñoz, who at that precise moment was perched on a stepladder, and stringing up colored light bulbs around the patio, while his chef was helping by holding the ladder. Suddenly, a lot of very excited people began streaming into the patio, all declaring the same thing, namely, that they had seen a ball of fire, of enormous size, which in the cases of several of them passed right above their very heads, and was lowering 3 legs to make a landing. Then, Ribera remarks, we come to one of the most baffling aspects of this whole affair. Some mysterious metal tubes were found at the landing site. One of these tubes was picked up by a young boy who had found it by chance, and had opened it with a pair of pliers. The boy said that when he opened the tube, a liquid had escaped from it and evaporated. Now, here is something extremely interesting. Ribera states, the tube contained 2 green strips, apparently of plastic, bearing a curious embossed emblem reminiscent of the mark on the belly of the UFO. These strips and a piece of the metal tube were eventually sent to the laboratories of the Spanish National Technical Institute for Aeronautics and Space Research, in Madrid. Ribera commented, the INTA analyzed them, and sent us a very detailed report of their findings. The metal sample was nickel of an extraordinary high degree of purity, while the plastic strip was polyvinyl fluoride, a type of plastic not yet available commercially. Consulting the technical literature of the subject, we discovered that this material, up to that date, had been manufactured by the American firm of DuPont Nemours. It had been made in a pilot plant by them for NASA. The latter were using it as a facing for the cones of Earth satellites, in order to protect them against the severe effects of the atmosphere, this plastic possessing extraordinary properties, and being virtually everlasting and immune against damage by any corrosive agency. Now, all this is highly suspicious. In an earlier book, The Flying Saucer Story, I gave an account of the Socorro landing in 1964. Briefly, at about 5:30 p.m. on April 24 that year, Lonnie Zamora, a Socorro, New Mexico police officer, was in his patrol car, and came in contact with what at first he thought was an overturned car. However, upon arriving at the spot he found an egg-shaped object, with markings over a foot high in red on one side of the craft. This particular sighting was investigated by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, then civilian consultant to the now-defunct Project Blue Book, and it is regarded as not only a classic sighting but a baffling one. However, the point I want to make is that the markings reproduced in my earlier book and which have appeared elsewhere, are not the true ones. I understand that the CIA stepped in very quickly, and deliberately altered the markings. Furthermore, a book will be published shortly, written by a ufologist who was with Dr. Hynek at the investigation, setting the record straight. However, I am told that the original markings on the Socorro object are not the same as on the San Jose de Valderas UFO. Now, When you take into account that so far as we are aware, out of all the thousands of UFOs reported, the only ones known to have had markings on them are the UFOs at Aluche and San Jose de Valderas in Spain, and the Socorro object in New Mexico, then a certain line of thought comes into operation. The question arises, are these particular ones man-made? If they are made by the Americans, then it is very much on the cards that they would put some form of marking on them. The fact too, that the type of plastic used in the tubes found on the ground is being used by NASA in the cones of Earth satellites, is very suspicious. It is a well-known fact that the American aircraft companies have been trying to solve the anti-gravity problem for years. Something like 18 years ago, Derek Dempster, who was then aviation correspondent of the Daily Express, and also the first editor of Flying Saucer Review, wrote in the January and February 1956 issue of the magazine, "The great puzzle now is, how much information has been gleaned from the prize, apparently in the possession of the U.S., and is it the reason for the sudden and intense activity now associated with gravity research?" The answer is a very difficult one to give at this juncture, but a brief review of the activities now going on in America may help to point to a conclusion. Last autumn, it was disclosed that no less than 35 electronics and aeronautical companies, and a number of universities and foundations were working on a program designed to probe the secrets of gravity, under the direction of some of America's top scientists. In addition, one of the aviation firms, the Martin Aircraft Company, had signed on two of Europe's leading authorities on gravity and electromagnetism, Dr. Burkhard Heim, professor of theoretical physics at Göttingen University, and Dr. Pascual Jordan of Hamburg University. Centers where pure research on gravity is now in progress in some form or another, include the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, and Princeton University, the University of Indiana School of Advanced Mathematical Study, and the Purdue University Research Foundation. Mr. Dempster went on to list aircraft companies, and other scientists interested at that time in gravity research. If all that work was going on some 18 years ago, very considerable advances must have been achieved in this field since then. The Americans could have reached the stage where they have top-secret experimental flying saucers. A recent article in Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers, an American UFO magazine, lists a remarkable number of patents granted by the United States Patent Office over the last few years, all of which are for inventions necessary for manufacturing a flying saucer. The day will come when the United States authorities announce to the world that the flying saucers do exist, and that they are man-made by them. When that day comes, ufologists must be prepared to deal with an even more complex situation. It will be hard to spot the real UFOs from elsewhere when man-made ones are flying openly around. Meanwhile, we can wonder about the markings on the UFOs seen in Spain. Were those particular UFOs secret American experimental craft? On the other hand, Senor Antonio Ribera and his associates are following up another fascinating trail. When Senor Ribera has collected sufficient evidence regarding his investigations, he will, possibly publicize the results of his inquiry. Whatever the answer to the mystery of the markings on the UFOs seen in Spain, you have been warned. It is very possible that the U.S. government may announce this year, next year, or in the foreseeable future, that the elusive flying saucers are made by them. Some of the UFOs may now be man-made, but do not be fooled. They are not all man-made. Not by any means.